March 19th, 1963. Studio 5, NBC Television, New York. The Maxwell Sterling Show was live. 20 million viewers. Maxwell Sterling was America's most famous talk show host, known for his sharp tongue, his mocking humor, his ability to corner celebrities. That evening, his guest was Louis Armstrong, Satchmo, the jazz legend, 62 years old, over 50 years of career. But Maxwell Sterling wasn't approaching Louis with respect. He was approaching him with mockery. The first 10 minutes went normally. Then Maxwell's tone changed. "Mr. Armstrong, are you really still relevant? I mean, have you heard of the Beatles?" The studio audience laughed. Louis smiled, that famous Satchmo smile. But he didn't answer. Maxwell continued, "Or are you still doing, how should I say, old-fashioned music?" More laughter. Louis remained silent again, just nodded his head, as if listening. But actually, he was waiting, because Louis Armstrong knew something Maxwell Sterling didn't know. The cameras were recording everything, and the moment coming at the end of the broadcast would go down in television history. Because Maxwell Sterling didn't know who he was trying to belittle, and Louis Armstrong was about to remind him. Before we dive into this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. What you're about to witness is one of the most powerful moments in television history, when grace defeated mockery and kindness triumphed over cruelty. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. To understand what happened that March evening in 1963, we need to go back several weeks. We need to understand what Louis Armstrong was experiencing in the early months of that year, because what happened on the Maxwell Sterling Show wasn't just about one evening. It was about a lifetime of dignity, patience, and the belief that kindness always wins in the end. February 20th, 1963. Louis Armstrong's home in Queens. Louis sat in his living room reading a letter. It was from his manager, Joe Glazer. "Louis, Maxwell Sterling wants you on his show. It's the biggest talk show in America. 20 million viewers. This could be great exposure." Louis set the letter down. He knew Maxwell Sterling's show. Everyone did. It was famous for being entertaining, but also cruel. Maxwell had a way of making guests uncomfortable, of finding their weak spots and exploiting them for laughs. Louis wasn't sure he wanted to be part of that. Lucille, his wife, noticed his hesitation. "What's wrong, baby?" Louis showed her the letter. "Maxwell Sterling wants me on his show." Lucille's face showed concern. "That man is mean. I've seen how he treats people." Louis nodded. "I know, but Joe thinks it's good for my career, says it'll reach younger audiences." Lucille sat beside him. "Louis, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You're Louis Armstrong. You've already done it all." But Louis knew something Lucille didn't. He knew Maxwell Sterling, not the famous talk show host, but the young man from 20 years ago. The struggling kid who'd needed help, and Louis had given it. The question was, did Maxwell remember? Louis decided to accept the invitation, not for exposure, not for his career, but because he was curious. Would Maxwell remember? Would he acknowledge the help Louis had given him decades ago, or would he pretend it never happened? February 25th, 1963, Louis began preparing for the show, but preparing wasn't about rehearsing answers or planning what to say. Louis never did that. He prepared by reminding himself of who he was. A musician, a survivor, someone who'd faced worse than a talk show host's mockery. Louis thought about his childhood in New Orleans, the poverty, the hunger, the racism. He'd survived all of that. He thought about his early career, the rejection, the struggle, the nights playing for pennies. He'd overcome all of that. He thought about the civil rights movement happening around him, the marches, the protests, the fight for dignity. He was part of that, even if quietly. One talk show host couldn't diminish Louis Armstrong, because Louis knew his worth, not from fame or success, but from the life he'd lived, the obstacles he'd overcome, the people he'd helped along the way, including, ironically, Maxwell Sterling. March 1st, 1963. Louis received the show's itinerary. He'd appear on March 19th, 2.5 weeks away. The show would be live, no editing, no do-overs. Whatever happened would be seen by 20 million people in real time. Louis felt calm. Lucille felt nervous. "Louis, promise me you won't let him hurt you." Louis smiled. "Lucille, nobody can hurt me unless I let them, and I don't plan on letting anyone hurt me." During those 2.5 weeks, Louis continued his usual routine, practicing trumpet, spending time with Lucille, writing letters to friends, living his life with the same grace and dignity he always had. But in the back of his mind, Louis was thinking about Maxwell Sterling, about 1943, about a young man who'd been desperate for a chance. Louis remembered it clearly. March 10th, 1943. 20 years earlier, Louis was performing at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. After the show, a young man approached him backstage. He was maybe 22 years old, thin, nervous, hopeful. "Mr. Armstrong, my name is Maxwell Sterling. I'm trying to get into radio. I want to be an announcer, maybe a host someday. But nobody will give me a chance." Louis had looked at this young man and seen himself, saw the hunger, the desperation, the dream. "What do you need, son?" Maxwell had explained. "There's a radio station, WNBC. They're hiring, but they want someone with experience. I don't have any, but if someone like you recommended me, maybe they'd give me a chance." Louis had listened, then asked, "Can you really do this? If I help you, will you work hard? Will you be good to people?" Maxwell had nodded eagerly. "I promise, Mr. Armstrong, I'll never forget this." Louis had made a phone call to a producer he knew at WNBC. "I got a young man here, name's Maxwell Sterling. He's green, but he's got something. Give him a shot." The producer had agreed, because if Louis Armstrong recommended someone, that meant something. Maxwell got the job, started at WNBC, entry level, answering phones, running errands, but he was in. He had his foot in the door, and from there, Maxwell climbed, worked his way up, from radio to television, from small shows to bigger ones, until, by 1963, Maxwell Sterling had his own primetime talk show, the biggest in America. But somewhere along the way, Maxwell forgot the struggling young man he'd been, forgot the hand that had helped him up, forgot Louis Armstrong. Or maybe he didn't forget. Maybe he remembered but chose to ignore it, because acknowledging it would mean admitting he owed someone. And Maxwell Sterling didn't like owing anyone. March 19th, 1963, the day of the show. Louis arrived at NBC Studios at 5 in the afternoon. The show would air live at 9. 4 hours of preparation, hair, makeup, sound check. Louis went through it all calmly. He'd done this 1,000 times. The show's producer, a nervous man named Richard, gave Louis the rundown. "Mr. Armstrong, Maxwell will ask about your career, your music, maybe about the Beatles and rock and roll. Just be yourself. It'll be great." Louis noticed what Richard didn't say. He didn't mention that Maxwell might be difficult, might mock, might try to make Louis look outdated. But Louis knew. He'd watched the show. He knew Maxwell's style. At 8:45, Louis was brought to the green room, the place where guests waited before going on stage. A television showed what was happening in the studio. Maxwell was doing his opening monologue, making jokes. The audience loved him. Louis watched quietly, studied Maxwell, this man who'd forgotten where he came from. At 9:15, a production assistant knocked on the green room door. "Mr. Armstrong, you're up in 5 minutes." Louis stood, picked up his trumpet, and walked toward the stage. As he walked down the corridor, Louis made a decision. Tonight, he wouldn't confront Maxwell, wouldn't call him out, wouldn't embarrass him. Instead, Louis would do what he always did. Be himself, play his music, show dignity, and let the truth speak for itself. Have you ever been disrespected by someone you once helped? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments. The studio lights were bright. The audience was large, 300 people packed into the studio. Beyond them, through cameras, 20 million more watched from home. Maxwell Sterling sat behind his desk, expensive suit, perfect hair, confident smile. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Louis Armstrong." The audience applauded. Louis walked out, trumpet in hand, waving to the crowd. He sat in the guest chair across from Maxwell. Maxwell extended his hand. Louis shook it. The handshake was brief, professional, but not warm. Maxwell dove right in. "Louis Armstrong, Satchmo, the legend himself. How does it feel to be Let's see, 62 years old and still playing trumpet. The question had an edge. The implication was clear. Aren't you too old? Louis smiled. Feels pretty good, Maxwell. I wake up every morning grateful I can still play. Maxwell nodded, but his expression showed he wasn't really listening. And you've been doing this for, 50 years? That's a long time. Do you ever think about retiring, letting the younger generation take over? Another pointed question. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Louis remained calm. Music isn't something you retire from. It's something you do as long as you can breathe. Maxwell leaned back. Speaking of younger generation, what do you think of the Beatles? I mean, they're huge right now. And does that make you feel, obsolete? The word hung in the air. Obsolete. The audience went quiet. Louis looked at Maxwell, really looked at him, and for a moment Louis considered saying it, reminding Maxwell of 1943, of the phone call, of the helping hand. But Louis chose silence. Instead he said, "The Beatles are talented young men. There's room for all kinds of music in the world." Maxwell sensed Louis wouldn't engage in conflict, so he pushed harder. "But let's be honest, Louis, jazz is dying, rock and roll is taking over. Your kind of music, it's nostalgic. It's for old folks, don't you think?" Now the audience, definitely uncomfortable. Some people gasped, but Louis remained composed. "Maxwell, music never dies. It evolves. Jazz gave birth to rock and roll. We're all connected." Maxwell wasn't satisfied. He wanted a reaction, wanted Louis to get defensive or angry, but Louis wouldn't give him that. The interview continued for 15 minutes. Maxwell kept poking, kept trying to diminish Louis, kept implying he was outdated, irrelevant, past his prime. Louis answered every question with grace, never raised his voice, never showed anger, just kept that smile on his face. But those who knew Louis could see it, the sadness in his eyes. Not for himself, for Maxwell, for what Maxwell had become. Finally, Maxwell said, "Well, Louis, we're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, you'll play something for us. And then we've got a little surprise." The cameras cut. Commercials rolled. During the break, Louis sat quietly. Maxwell didn't speak to him, didn't acknowledge him, just reviewed his notes for the next segment, the surprise he'd mentioned. Louis knew what was coming, some kind of stunt, some way to make him look foolish. Richard, the producer, looked worried. He approached Maxwell during the break. "Maxwell, maybe we should ease up. The audience doesn't seem to be enjoying this." Maxwell waved him off. "They'll love the surprise, trust me." After 3 minutes, they were back on air. Maxwell addressed the camera. "We're back with Louis Armstrong. Now, Louis has been kind enough to agree to play something for us." "Louis, so what will you be playing?" Louis spoke clearly. "I'll play What a Wonderful World," Maxwell smirked. "A wonderful world. Interesting choice. Okay, take it away." Louis stood, brought his trumpet to his lips, and began to play. What happened next was magic, pure, undeniable magic. The notes that came from Louis's trumpet weren't just technically perfect, they were transcendent. Every note carried decades of experience, pain, joy, love, loss, and hope. The studio fell completely silent. Even Maxwell stopped shuffling his papers. The audience sat mesmerized. Louis played for 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, everyone in that studio remembered why Louis Armstrong was a legend. Not because of his age, not because of nostalgia, but because his music touched something deep in the human soul. Please subscribe to our channel if this story is resonating with you. What happens next will restore your faith in the power of grace and truth. When Louis finished, there was silence, complete silence, for 3 full seconds. Then the audience erupted. They stood, applauded, cheered, whistled. Some were crying. Louis had done it again, reminded everyone that true artistry transcends trends, age, or anything else. Maxwell, caught off guard by the response, forced a smile. "Well, that was very nice indeed." He looked at the camera. "And now, for our surprise." A stagehand wheeled out a small table. On it was a birthday cake, Maxwell explained. "Louis, we heard that your birthday's coming up in a few months. August 4th, right? So we thought we'd celebrate early. Here's a cake." The audience clapped politely. But something felt off. This was the surprise. A cake, Maxwell continued, "and we thought it would be fun if you could blow out the candles, show us you've still got the lung capacity." There it was. The final insult. Treat Louis like a child. Make him blow out candles. Reduce him to a gimmick. The audience sensed it. The applause died down. People looked uncomfortable. Louis looked at the cake, at Maxwell, at the cameras, and he made a decision. Instead of getting angry, instead of refusing, Louis did something unexpected. He spoke, not to Maxwell, to the audience, to the cameras, to the 20 million people watching. You know, Maxwell, I appreciate the cake. That's real kind, but before I blow out these candles, I want to tell you and everyone watching something important. Maxwell looked surprised. This wasn't in the script. Louis, we're running short on time. Louis ignored him. I've lived 62 years, and in those 62 years, I've learned something. The most important thing you can do in life is help others, give people a chance, lift them up when they're down. Maxwell shifted uncomfortably. Louis continued. 20 years ago, I met a young man. He was struggling, trying to get into radio. Nobody would give him a chance. But I saw something in him, potential. So I made a phone call, got him his first job. The audience was riveted. Maxwell's face went pale. Louis looked directly at him. That young man worked hard, climbed his way up, and today he's one of the most successful people in television. Maxwell knew. He remembered, and he realized what was happening. Louis's voice remained gentle. I don't tell you this to brag. I tell you this because it matters. How we treat people matters. The help we give matters. The kindness we show matters. Maxwell tried to interrupt. Louis, I think... But Louis wasn't done. And you know what I've learned? Sometimes people forget. They forget where they came from, forget who helped them. And that's okay, because helping people isn't about getting credit. It's about doing what's right. The studio was silent. Everyone understood what Louis was saying. Maxwell Sterling had forgotten Louis Armstrong's help. And now... Live on television, Louis was reminding him, but not with anger. With love, Louis smiled. So, Maxwell, thank you for having me on your show. Thank you for this cake, and thank you for reminding me why I do what I do. I make music to bring joy to people, to help them remember what's important: love, kindness, connection. Louis blew out the candles. The audience exploded. They understood what had just happened. Louis Armstrong had just delivered one of the most graceful, powerful lessons in television history. In the control room, the director was panicking. He spoke into Maxwell's earpiece. We need to cut to commercial. But Maxwell pulled out his earpiece, threw it on the desk, and for the first time that night, looked Louis in the eye. Really looked at him. Louis, Maxwell's voice cracked. I remember 1943. I remember you calling that producer. I remember you giving me a chance. Tears formed in Maxwell's eyes. And I forgot. I forgot to thank you. I forgot to acknowledge you. I forgot everything you did for me. The cameras captured it all. 20 million people watched Maxwell Sterling break down on live television. Louis walked over to Maxwell, put a hand on his shoulder. It's okay, son. We all forget sometimes. What matters is we remember eventually. Maxwell looked up at Louis. How can you forgive me after how I treated you tonight? Louis smiled, that beautiful Satchmo smile. Because holding grudges is heavy, and I've got a trumpet to carry. I can't carry both. The audience laughed through their tears. Even the crew was emotional. What was supposed to be a mockery had become a moment of redemption. Maxwell stood up, extended his hand to Louis. But Louis pulled him into a hug. Right there, on live television, the host and the guest, the young man who'd forgotten, and the older man who'd always remembered. When they separated, Maxwell addressed the camera, his voice shaking. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to tell you something. Everything Louis said is true. 20 years ago, when nobody would give me a chance, Louis Armstrong made one phone call and changed my life. And tonight, I tried to mock him, tried to make him look outdated, tried to get laughs at his expense. Maxwell paused, wiped his eyes. I was wrong. Louis Armstrong is more relevant than I will ever be. Not because of his music, though that's incredible, but because of his character, his kindness, his grace. He had every right to embarrass me tonight, to call me out for forgetting him, but instead he reminded me who I'm supposed to be. Maxwell turned to Louis. Thank you for the help 20 years ago, for the lesson tonight, and for showing me what true class looks like. Louis nodded. You're welcome, Maxwell. Now, how about I play one more song before we go? Maxwell laughed. Please. Louis picked up his trumpet and played "When the Saints Go Marching In." The audience sang along, the crew sang along, even Maxwell, tears still on his face, sang along. And in living rooms across America, 20 million people sang along too, because Louis Armstrong had reminded everyone watching of something essential: that kindness matters, that grace defeats cruelty, that the truest power isn't in tearing others down, but in lifting them up. When the show ended, the phones at NBC lit up, thousands of calls, people wanting to express how moved they were. Newspapers the next day ran the story on front pages. Louis Armstrong delivers television's greatest moment. Jazz legend schools talk show host in Grace and Dignity. The show's ratings broke records. It became the most watched episode of The Maxwell Sterling Show ever. But more importantly, it changed things. Maxwell Sterling's approach to his show changed. He became less cruel, more respectful. He still asked tough questions, but without the mockery, and he never forgot to acknowledge people who'd helped him. In interviews afterward, Maxwell always credited that night. "Louis Armstrong saved me. Not just my career 20 years ago, but my soul that night in March 1963. He showed me that you can be honest and kind at the same time. You can be successful without being cruel." Louis characteristically downplayed his role. When reporters asked about the incident, he said, "I just told the truth, that's all. Maxwell's a good man who lost his way for a moment. We all do that sometimes. But those who were there, who witnessed it, knew it was more than that. Louis Armstrong had done something almost impossible. He'd been publicly disrespected and responded with such grace that he not only defended himself, but redeemed his attacker. The incident became famous in television history. Film students studied it. Communications professors used it as an example of authentic human connection. Therapists referenced it when discussing healthy conflict resolution. Because what Louis did that night was show a different way, not the way of revenge or public humiliation, but the way of truth spoken with love, of calling someone out while simultaneously lifting them up, of holding people accountable while offering them grace. Years later, in 1970, a year before Louis died, Maxwell Sterling visited him. They'd stayed in touch over the years, become real friends. Maxwell sat with Louis in his Queens home. "Louis, I've been thinking about that night in '63. Louis smiled. "That was a good night." Maxwell shook his head. "You were amazing. I still can't believe how you handled me. I was so cruel. And you met it with love." Louis thought for a moment. "Maxwell, you weren't cruel. You were scared. Success is scary, makes you afraid of losing it, so you tear others down to feel safe. But I knew you were better than that. I just had to remind you." Maxwell's eyes filled with tears. "You changed my life twice. Once by giving me a chance, and once by showing me how to be a better man." Louis patted his hand. "You changed your own life, son. I just held up a mirror." When Louis Armstrong passed away in July 1971, Maxwell Sterling delivered a eulogy at the funeral. He spoke about that March night in 1963, about how Louis had saved him from becoming someone he would have hated. "Louis Armstrong taught me that true strength isn't in dominating others," Maxwell said. "It's in uplifting them. True power isn't in being right. It's in being kind. And true success isn't in what you achieve, it's in how you treat people along the way." Maxwell concluded with tears streaming down his face. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to be half the man Louis Armstrong was. And I will fail. Because Louis wasn't just a great musician, he was a great human being, the greatest I've ever known." Today, footage of that March 1963 broadcast is preserved in the Library of Congress, recognized as a significant moment in American cultural history. Not for the music, though Louis's performance was extraordinary, but for the lesson, the demonstration of how to handle disrespect with dignity, how to speak truth with love, how to hold people accountable while offering redemption. Television has had many memorable moments, scandalous interviews, shocking revelations, dramatic confrontations, but few moments have had the lasting impact of Louis Armstrong on The Maxwell Sterling Show, because it wasn't drama for drama's sake. It wasn't shock value or sensationalism. It was genuine, authentic, real. It was a man who'd lived 62 years with grace, showing the world what grace looked like under pressure. A man who'd overcome poverty, racism, rejection, and countless obstacles, demonstrating that none of those hardships had hardened his heart. A man who'd been hurt, showing that hurt doesn't have to turn to bitterness. That night, Louis Armstrong didn't just play beautiful music. He was beautiful music. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, every moment of patience he showed was a note in a larger composition. A song about humanity, about forgiveness, about redemption. Maxwell Sterling had tried to make Louis Armstrong look small, and in doing so, Maxwell had shown his own smallness. But Louis, instead of capitalizing on that, instead of destroying Maxwell when he had the chance, chose to elevate him, to remind him of his potential, to believe in him again. That's what separated Louis Armstrong from others. Not his musical talent, though that was transcendent, but his capacity to see the best in people even when they showed him their worst. His ability to respond to cruelty with kindness. His commitment to living with integrity, no matter how others treated him. March 19, 1963. Studio 5, NBC Television. 20 million people tuned in expecting entertainment. What they got was education, a masterclass in human dignity, a demonstration that the high road isn't just morally right, it's also strategically effective. Louis Armstrong could have destroyed Maxwell Sterling that night, could have exposed him as an ungrateful man who'd forgotten the person who'd helped him, could have humiliated him in front of 20 million people. The ammunition was there. The opportunity was perfect. But Louis chose differently, because Louis understood something many people never learn. That revenge feels good for a moment, but regret lasts forever. That humiliating someone might win a battle, but loses the war for your own soul. That true victory isn't in defeating your enemies, but in turning them into friends. When the cameras finally shut off that night, when the studio audience had left, when the crew was packing up equipment, Louis and Maxwell sat together in the now empty studio. Just the two of them. Talking, Maxwell apologized again. Louis accepted again. They talked about the past, about the present, about the future, and they made a promise to stay in touch, to remember, to keep each other accountable. That conversation, unrecorded and private, might have been even more important than what happened on camera, because it showed that Louis's grace wasn't performance. It was who he was, whether cameras were rolling or not, whether 20 million people were watching or just one. Louis Armstrong treated people with dignity, always. The sun rose over New York City on March 20th, 1963, the morning after. Newspaper deliveries brought the story to millions. Television news programs replayed clips. Radio shows discussed it. And across America, in living rooms and offices and schools, people talked about what they'd witnessed. A moment of genuine humanity in an increasingly cynical world. A reminder that grace still existed. That kindness still mattered. That one person, standing firm in their values, could change not just a conversation, but potentially a culture. Louis Armstrong woke that morning in his Queens home, made coffee, sat with Lucille, read some of the news coverage, and mostly he felt grateful. Grateful he'd stayed true to himself. Grateful he'd shown restraint. Grateful he'd chosen love over anger, because that's what Louis had done his entire life. Chosen love. Even when it was hard, even when it would have been easier to choose bitterness. Even when people didn't deserve it, Maxwell Sterling woke that morning a different man, humbled, grateful, determined to do better. The young man who'd received help 20 years ago had forgotten, but the adult who'd been reminded the night before would never forget again. And both men, in their own ways, understood something profound. That life gives us moments. Moments of choice. Moments where we decide who we want to be. Louis had his moment and chose grace. Maxwell had his moment and chose to receive that grace and change, and 20 million people watched and learned that redemption is possible, that people can change, that it's never too late to remember who you're supposed to be. That, ultimately, is the legacy of that March night in 1963. Not the drama, not the spectacle, but the lesson, that the measure of a person isn't how they act when everything is going well. It's how they respond when someone treats them poorly. Louis Armstrong passed that test, with flying colors, with a trumpet in his hand and love in his heart, with grace that changed not just one man's life but touched millions. The cameras caught it all, the truth, the redemption, the love, and preserved it forever. A reminder for generations to come of what's possible when one person decides that kindness is stronger than cruelty, that grace is more powerful than revenge, that love, in the end, always wins. Thank you, Louis Armstrong, for the music, for the lesson, for showing us the way, for proving that being good isn't being weak, that gentleness is strength, that the greatest power any of us possess is the power to lift others up. The lights in Studio 5 have long since gone dark. The Maxwell Sterling show ended its run years ago. The people who were there that night have mostly passed on. But the moment lives, forever captured, forever teaching, forever inspiring, because truth, when spoken with love, never dies. It echoes through time, touching hearts in every generation, reminding us all of who we can be, if we just have the courage to be like Louis, to choose grace, to believe in redemption, to love even when it's hard. That's the real story of March 19, 1963. Not famous host mocks legend, but legend transforms famous host, with nothing but truth, love, and one beautiful trumpet. The end? No. The beginning of understanding, of hope, of a better way, forever.